The narrative, of course, is that whites in general, white men in particular, are the greatest threat to America. Systemic racism, pernicious racism, foundational racism, endemic racism. Hate crime stats, 2019 FBI. Where the hate crime offender is known. Where the hate crime had to do with race, there were 6,406 known hate crime offenders. Of these offenders, 52.5% were white. And again, whites are roughly, 61, 62% of the population, so they are underrepresented in hate crimes. 23.9% were black or African American, according to the 2019 FBI crime stats. So blacks at 13% of the population commit proportionately more hate crimes. What about crime in general? According to the Department of Justice's Felony Defendants in Large Urban Counties, 2009, in the country's 75 largest counties, blacks committed 62% of the robberies, 45% of the assaults, accounted for 57% of the murder defendants. Number one cause of preventable death for young white men is accidents. As I said before, like car accidents or drowning accidents. The number one cause of death, preventable or not, for a young black man, homicide, and almost always committed by another young black man. Yet, according to Mina Harris, Vice President Kamala Harris's daughter, quote, violent white men are the greatest terrorist threat to our country, end of quote, her niece, rather. Walter Williams, shortly before he died, wrote a column. Headline, is racism responsible for today's black problems? Pointed out an average of roughly 9,000 black-on-black murders in recent years. That translates into nearly 324,000 blacks murdered at the hands of other blacks. Only a tiny percentage were killed by cops. This is in Reuters, June of last year. Reuters contacted two statisticians, Regina Nuzzo, Ph.D., and Lucas Minch, Ph.D., from the American Statistical Association. Quote, it says, Nuzzo, if you're a white person in 2013, based on FBI data, your chances of being killed by anyone, roughly 13 in a million. If you're a black person in 2013, your chances of being killed by anyone, 62 in a million. 5 times what the odds are for a white person. If you're a white person in 2013, he said, your chances of being murdered by another white person, 11 in a million. You're a black person in 2013, your chances of being murdered by another black person, 56 in a million. Again, 5 times the rate. And the reason for this is a breakdown of the family, as I mentioned a million times, but nobody wants to talk about that. Let's just talk about how racist white people are. Let's ignore the number one reason for the problems in the inner city, the lack of fathers in the home. That hub has spokes that reach out to everything: crime, education, readiness to compete in our job market. But let's not talk about that. Walter Williams, in the article I mentioned, writes that, according to a professor named Herbert Gutman, research called The Black Family in Slavery and Freedom from 1750 to 1925, he found that 3/4 of 19th century slave families, all the children had the same mother and father. In New York City, in 1925, 85% of black households were two-parent. In fact, quote, 5 in 6 children under the age of 6 live with both parents, end of quote. An 1880 study of family structure in Philadelphia shows that 3/4 of all black families were nuclear families. There are only slight differences in family structure between racial groups. Percentage of nuclear families were black, 75.2%, Irish, 82.2%, German, 84.5%, Native white Americans, 73.1%. Only 1/4 of black families were female-headed. Female-headed families among Irish, German, and Native white Americans average 11%. According to the 1938 Encyclopedia of Social Services, only 11% of black children and 3% of white children were born to unwed mothers, 1938. Thomas Sowell said this, and I'm quoting him, "Going back 100 years, when blacks were just one generation out of slavery, we find that census data of that era showed that a slightly higher percentage of black adults had married than white adults. That fact remained true in every census from 1880 to 1940, end of quote." Walter Williams concludes the article with this: "The absence of a father in the home predisposes children, especially boys, to academic failure, criminal behavior, and economic hardship, not to mention an intergenerational repeating of handicaps. If today's weak family structure is a legacy of slavery," he writes, "then the people who make such a claim must tell us how it managed to skip nearly 5 generations to have an effect," end of quote.